Is this gonna work? Wow. Okay. Intro. Hey friends, welcome to Poor Man's Magic, a place where the wild cards never rain on our parade. Today we are taking a look at a Wilds of Eldraine budget deck centered around everyone's favorite street chef, Rocco. So food is a huge mechanic in this particular set, and in Eldraine in general. When we have some new really nice tools to make Rocco go. So let's start in the 1 slot and make our way through this deck. We have, as the sole creature in the 1 slot, Teething Wurmlet, a 1 green creature worm that has Death Touch as long as you control 3 or more artifacts, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. If it's the first time this ability resolves, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Teething Wurmlet. We also have 1 copy of Gleeful Demolition, a 1 red sorcery which lets you destroy a target artifact, and if you controlled that artifact, you create 3 1/1 goblin creature tokens, and 2 copies of a new artifact called Candy Trail for 1 colorless, which is an artifact food clue. When Candy Trail enters the battlefield, you get to scry 2, and you can also, as you do with most food, pay 2 life, tap it, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. However, you also get to draw a card. In the 2 slot, we have, if you have followed my channel for any amount of time, one of my very favorite cards from Standard in the past few rotations, and something I think is way underutilized in all of the artifact based decks. Yotia Declares War, a 1 mana, 1 red saga. The first chapter of which says you get to create an O2 colorless Thopter artifact creature token. The second chapter, you get to tap any number of untapped artifacts you control, and Yotia Declares War deals that much damage to a target creature or planeswalker. And then the third chapter, you get to turn any artifact into a creature with base power and toughness 4 and 4. Yotia Declares War is nasty in this deck. If you draw into it early and you don't have any other plays, you can play this for the first chapter, create a colorless Thopter artifact creature, maybe trigger your Teething Wurmlet, gain a life, put a counter. Great, you're on with your life. However, if you get to put this down a little bit later, maybe turn 3, 4, 5, maybe you have a Wurmlet down, maybe you have an Elvish Archivist, which we'll get to shortly, maybe you have a Patchwork Automaton down, maybe you have a Rocco or a Miria, Yotia Declares War can really make this go off. And it can take out things like a Shieldred, 5 toughness, 6 toughness. I even in one of my practice rounds took out a 7/7 Titan of Industry. This food deck can go off. The next new card I'm going to show you in the 2 slot is Elvish Archivist, a 1 colorless, 1 green creature elf artificer that says whenever 1 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on Elvish Archivist. This ability only triggers once per turn. However, when 1 or more enchantments enter the battlefield, you get to draw a card, which also only triggers once. This makes something like Yotia a incredible, potentially 3-for-1 move. Say you have a few food tokens out on the battlefield already, you have an Elvish Archivist down, you play down Yotia, you draw off the enchantment entering, Yotia creates a colorless artifact, you get to buff your Elvish Archivist there, and then maybe if you wanted to go to the second chapter instead, you get to tap a bunch of artifacts and do some damage. These combos are really crazy, and you wouldn't expect them coming out of 1 and 2 drops. So moving along, we also have a new card, Tough Cookie, a 1 colorless, 1 green artifact food golem creature that says when Tough Cookie enters the battlefield, you get to create a food token, which is amazing because it itself is also a food. And for 2 mana and 1 green, you can turn a target non-creature artifact into a 4/4 artifact creature until end of turn. You can also pay to tap and sacrifice Tough Cookie to gain 3 life. This is really dumb. It's really dumb and really fun. If you're doing nothing but creating food tokens, oftentimes you don't feel like you're doing a whole lot until Tough Cookie comes down and turns 6 or 7 or 8, and then all of a sudden you can just start launching 4/4s at your opponent's face. This is a really fun card. We also have, again, a new saga from Wilds of Eldraine. Welcome to Sweettooth, a 1 mana, 1 green saga. The first chapter lets you create a 1/1 white human creature token. The second chapter, you create a food token. And the third chapter lets you do silly things. Depending on how much food you have accumulated, you get to put X +1/+1 counters on a target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of foods. So you're always going to be putting at least 1 +1/+1 counter. If you have 3, 4, 5 foods, early game to late game, you're putting on some huge buffs onto things like your 0-2 colorless flyer, your 1/1 Teething Wurmlet, your 1/1 Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. This is an incredible enabler. Again, it seems very unimposing, it seems non-threatening, until you watch it go off. And then rounding out the 2 slot, we have Patchwork Automaton, a 2 colorless artifact creature construct with Ward 2 that says whenever you cast an artifact spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Patchwork Automaton. So as you'll see, there are a lot of +1/+1 counter mechanics going on here, and I'm sure there's some way to incorporate some of the counters matter cards from prior sets to make something a little bit different from this, which I would encourage you to try out. And if you find something cool, shoot me a message. Let me know what you're working with. But in the 3 slot, we have a few other enablers, a few other interesting mechanics. We have the Restoration of Eiganjo for 2 mana, 1 white, which is again a saga. We like our sagas around here. The first chapter allows you to search your library for a basic plains, reveal it, and put it into your hand. This is going to help you smooth some of your draws. It's going to help you maybe get another plains for Kayla's Reconstruction. And then in the second chapter, this is where things really get interesting. And this is where we can really start pulling ahead. So you can discard a card, and when you do, you can return a target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can return any target permanent card from your graveyard with mana value 2 or less. Turns out that is almost the entire deck. You can return something like another saga that can all of a sudden create a significant amount of value. Restoration, if you can have a 4 of here, I would say it's a 4 of, but I wouldn't quite know what to drop. We also have 1 copy of Miria, Scholar of Antiquity, a 1 mana, 1 red, 1 green, legendary elf artificer, which allows you to tap an untapped non-token artifact you control to add some mana. And you can also tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts you control to exile the top card of your library. Miria is really good in artifact decks. However, the non-token artifact language makes it not the absolute strongest here. So we won't be able to use our food tokens here. We can only use things like our candy trails, things like our tough cookies, our patchwork automatons, in order to use those 2 activated abilities. However, it is still maybe worth having a 1 of in this deck. We also have Rocco, Street Chef, a 1 red, 1 green, 1 white, which is going to let us, at the beginning of our end step, exile the top card of each player's library, and until the next end step, each player can play their respective cards. Whenever a player plays a land from exile or casts a spell from exile, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature and create a food token. So anytime something is played from exile, if Rocco is on the board, and say a Teething Wurmlet is on the board, Rocco is going to create a food token, it's going to buff our Wurmlet, and it can put another +1/+1 counter on. Essentially, every turn, provided one of the players is playing something from exile that Rocco has given them, we are putting 2 +1/+1 counters essentially for free. It is a passive ability. If Rocco gets answered immediately, it's a little less good, but at a 2 power 4 toughness stat line, this does dodge cut down and some of the smaller removals that are going around, like the -3/-3 adventures. Rocco is super strong, and I'm excited to see it play out. We also have in the technically 3-drop, however, we'll put this up in the 5-drop. So moving to the 4-drop, we have 2 copies of Food Coma, a 3 mana, 1 white enchantment, which when it enters the battlefield allows us to exile a target creature an opponent controls, and we get to create a food token. So this is just a little bit of our removal, aside from Yotia Declares War, some non-damage based exile removal, and it helps out with the food thing. And then lastly, Kayla's Reconstruction, an X-cost 3 white mana sorcery, which allows us to look at the top 7 cards of our library and put up to X artifacts and or creature cards with mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield. If we get to the late game, or maybe if we're even on turn 5, we can play this out for X equals 2, X equals 3, and completely fill our board. We could grab something like an Archivist into an Automaton into a Rocco, and all of a sudden, things are getting really, really nasty. This deck is persistent, it has great staying power, and is able to recover really, really well. The only thing it doesn't do particularly well is draw cards. So that could be maybe the Achilles heel of our little food golems, but as of now, I think this is in a really good place. And then very quickly taking a look at our mana base. Most of our cards are going to be green and red with only a little bit of splashing white. So if you need to cut more of these dual lands because you don't have them, just make sure that you are representing your red and green needs adequately, and maybe adding 7 or 8 planes maybe at the most. You can also have a couple fetch lands if you need them, but for now this is, I think, a pretty reasonable place to leave it. So let's take our Rocco Street Chef food deck into the play queue in Standard and see how it does. Okay, on the play against Bones, super strong 1-2-3 here. Wurmlet into Archivist into Rocco, into maybe even a food coma. That's pretty strong. Can't give that one up. So Wurmlet out onto the battlefield, and we'll see where we go from here. Tapped Deathcap Glade from opponent. So Archivist it is. Wurmlet pecks opponent for 1. Imagine the Archivist gets killed here. Golgari is really good at doing that sort of thing. But if Archivist eats the removal, Rocco will not. So maybe we'll get another option here. Yeah, they go for the throat immediately. Interesting play there. So that opens up the way for Rocco, which I'm pretty happy about, to be honest. Food Coma is at the ready for something like a Shield Drid that comes down. Ooh, Obliterator. That's pretty nasty. Okay, so Sweettooth is our kind of draw into exile off Rocco, which isn't too bad. Opponent has 3 mana. We can dodge a sacrifice effect by taking out our Wurmlet, but just another go for the throat. Beautiful. Okay, so Food Coma is going to be a good answer for some of their big creatures. Sweettooth is pretty much all we have now. We'll go ahead and once again peck for 1. So our 2 biggest threats have been answered by back-to-back go for the throats into Obliterator. They had another one in hand. That's pretty wild. Finally, we can start growing. I kind of like the idea of keeping Eiganjo in hand. But if we play it down here, we can Food Coma, blow up our food token, one of our food tokens, and then have 3 other creatures on board. And especially against an Obliterator deck, I really like the idea of having a lot of small creatures. So I think I'm going to go ahead and take that chance. Because this also dodges Lilianas if they have them. It makes a lot of their Planeswalkers quite a bit weaker. They can't, you know, bring out a Sorin, create a blocker, that sort of thing. And if we need to, we can go straight to the 3rd chapter of Yotia Declares War and have this food token become a 4/4. Always an option. Underdog, that's fine. Not a big deal from us. Rocco off the top is pretty phenomenal. So we'll go ahead, we will buff up Teething Wurmlet, because we're going to put down Yotia. They fire off an Edict. What? I don't know about that one, friend. But so it goes. Okay, so Yotia Declares War comes down. We're going to create a... Wow. Create a colorless Thopter. Looks like they still have a cut down. That's pretty gnarly. Or a fight spell, I guess. If they were running Obliterators, they might have a 1 mana, 1 green fight spell. Luckily, Rocco has 4 toughness, which is phenomenal. So we'll go ahead and let that come down. We'll create our Thopter. I don't think we should be attacking quite yet, but we could get them down to 11. See what comes off Rocco. It's pretty tempting, to be fair. And I think we're going to want to buff up our Thopters as it is. Okay, that's fine. Get into 3, play a Rocco. And the fact that Rocco escapes cutdown is so nice. So nice. Kayla's Reconstruction off the top is a beautiful, beautiful sight. So we'll be able to pull 2 things off the off our next draw. I'm kind of liking where we are, to be fair. It might seem like we've run out of gas, but Kayla's Reconstruction is gonna get it going pretty fast. Now Bones is really thinking about this. Yep, they did have a tail swipe, so fight spell. So the Tenacious Underdog is now a 4/2, but just by trying to get around us putting a counter on a thing, they've used a really important fight spell. If they had taken a second to think about that, maybe they have a second one in hand? Because they could have taken out Rocco there instead. I don't really understand. Yeah. Is this gonna work? Wow. Okay. So in that case, we will go ahead and play out Kayla's Reconstruction for 2. See what we find off the top. We will now start buffing up our Thopter. See if opponent wants to do anything about that. Ooh. Automaton into Wurmlet is really, really nice. However, I think I'm going to go for Candy Trail so that we can establish a little bit of scry and also a draw to keep our foot on the pedal a little bit more. Really nice find, though. Miria, an even better one. So we can go Miria into Tough Cookie and still have some more card draw. Next turn, we're going to have Yotia turning something into a 4/4. I really, really like where we're going here. Opponent may be a little bit baffled as to what to do with us here. We know they have a bunch of scary things. They did play their land, which I'm a little surprised by. I feel like they should know better at this point. But Rocco continuing to serve out, dish out some sweet, sweet, savory value. Opponent tail swipes our Wurmlet. Wow. At any point, they could have tail swiped with their underdog to take out Rocco. I feel like they made that little mistake and now they're just trying to recover, but I don't think they're going to be able to. Maybe with a Phyrexian Obliterator here, they could stymie our board at best, but looks like they're really thinking about it. They disallow us some life gain from the Wurmlet. They blitz out the underdog, attack in. This looks like a desperation play. No matter what they do here, we have taken the game off the back of Yotia, and yeah, off the back of Rocco. Really, really pleased with this showing. Go ahead, we will pull up our food token. We will go ahead and attack here, just to save everybody some time. We'll see what opponent wants to do about that. They were holding on to a cut down the entire time. Alright. Good game, Bones. Golgari stuff. Golgari fight, maybe? Either way, on to the next one. Okay, on the play against Darth. We have Wurmlet into a Candy Trail. Yotia Declares War, Restoration at the ready. We have our Miria. This looks pretty good. See what we are up against here. Okay, turn 1 plains, but we drew into a Tough Cookie. Go ahead and pump up our Wurmlet, create a food token, gain a couple life. Best case scenario here, we draw into a red mana. I guess that's probably okay. So we'll go ahead and we will play down Boseiju into our Restoration. We can now discard something to the second chapter of Eiganjo and bring it back. So we can either drop a Plains, or what I think I'll probably do is drop Candy Trail and try to scry into a red mana. I think that could work well. Nothing yet from opponent, though. Makes me wonder if they're waiting for a second color of land. Wedding Announcement, okay. So this could be a pure token deck, or it could be some other things. I now kind of like the idea of dropping Automaton, because that way we can grow it with Candy Trail. Get a little scry on. Another Automaton into a Sweettooth. I think Automaton will take, Sweettooth we won't. We'll play down our Plains. We will turn that, our food, into a creature and attack for 9. Seems pretty good. Next turn we'll have Eiganjo flipping. We can draw something with our Candy Trail. We'll see what comes through here. And Darth gives it up. Yeah, I don't blame him. There aren't a whole lot of games in Standard where you can not play something for turns 1 and 2 and get away with it, but a token build maybe could have. It's just that our creatures are so accretive in terms of gaining a +1 counter every turn, building themselves up in power and toughness, that we can start with very little and really snowball fast. So yeah, a pretty good showing from the food deck. On to the next one. Okay, on the draw against Ribe, or Ribe, we have an Archivist, an Automaton, a Yotia Declares War. We have as much mana as we could probably need here, so yeah, it's a definite keep. Mono white, or Selesnya Toxic. We are going to slow roll this a little bit, but we'll go ahead and destroy Skrelv instead of using this on our own later on. Some nice flexibility early from Gleeful Demolition on display there. Opponent plays out Hex Gold Halberd. So it looks like this is going to be an equipment deck. Not what we were expecting at all. So yeah, I think I feel pretty good here with getting Archivist onto the board. Next turn we will go for either Rocco or Yotia Declares War. We'll start getting some draw and some buff out of our multi-value cards. Jorkaden, first Gold Warden. Okay, so yeah, a lot of creatures coming up here. I kind of like the idea of getting Rocco out on the board. It's not very likely that we're going to draw into a 1-mana spell, but I think, yeah, I think next turn we can double spell, potentially have enough artifacts to take something out. So yeah, we'll go ahead and go with Rocco here. It's pretty high toughness. It might be able to hold down the fort. Food Coma's on deck, which is good for us. If they play their land, they're going to be sorry. They do play it. We'll go ahead and buff up our Archivist. We have a 3/4 on the board now. Two very nice defenders. Facing a very aggro deck. Ossification comes down. Okay. Unfortunately, that is an enchantment. We can't really do anything about that, except, oh wait, we can with Food Coma. So we have some really nice defenders. I can't imagine they're going to attack in. We can Food Coma the Ossification, buff up our Archivist again, get our Rocco back. Or we could start taking out things like their Jor-Kadeen by double spelling Automaton into Yotia Declares War. They are attacking here. I don't understand why. They're going to be one short. No, they'll get +2/+2. Yeah, okay, never mind. I was the one who had miscounted. So we'll let that hit. I think Jor-Kadeen's going to be an issue for us. I would like to get rid of it as soon as possible. So we'll go ahead, we'll play down Patchwork Automaton. We will play out Yotia Declares War. We will read ahead, tap our Automaton, and our food token, deal 2 damage to Jor-Kadeen, and shut down their card draw. We'll hang back with our Archivist and try to play a little defense. Now, we didn't get our Rocco back. I think Rocco might have been a little bit slow there. It might have let them get a little too far ahead. Hopefully we're not going to see any other equipment come down. But at 6 toughness, Archivist is really holding down the fort here. Next turn we can double spell Sweettooth into Eiganjo. Looks like they're going to try to build up a 5/3 trample first striker. Not sure if they quite did the math right on that. Okay. Opponent is buffing up some creatures, thinking about how they want to distribute things. That's fine. They play out a land. I can't imagine they're going to do anything else here. And they don't. Pass the turn. Eiganjo, a really, really nice find. So that actually kind of changes my mind. We don't have any legendary creatures, so I think at this point we play down our Brushland, we play a Sweettooth, we hold open Eiganjo, and we attack in brazenly with our Archivist. But now we also have an Automaton. I think we have to attack in with both of these. I'm more than happy to trade off for our food token. They allow the damage through, which puts us in striking distance. And so the idea here is, because of this attack, which they were unlikely to block, we can surprise them with our Eiganjo, Seat of the Empire. We can take out an attacking creature if they happen to buff it up a little bit more. And then this kind of baits them into trying to apply pressure in the next turn, setting us then up for a little bit of a surprise and then to counter swing back effectively. But we'll see what kind of aggression Reba takes. In fact, none at all. They take one simple look at our little Sweettooth over here, and they call it in. GG's, Reba. On to the next one. Okay, so that is... Okay, so with that, we're going to call it a day for our pared down, fewer rares food deck built around Rocco Street Chef. But before we bring this to an end, let's go over kind of how we would make some improvements to this based off the gameplay. Now, halfway through, I did add 2 glass caskets. I had forgotten about this card prior to wanting more removal, especially artifact-based removal, and then I remembered it existed. So I added 2 copies of Glass Casket. I took out 1 Yotia and 1 Sweettooth, and I think that works very, very well. I really like the idea of triggering Archivist twice with something like a Yotia or with a Sweettooth. However, I do think the enchantments slow down some of our synergies a little bit, especially on the back of something like Akela's Reconstruction. So with Reconstruction, you don't want to be hitting 1 or 2 Restorations, Yotias, or Sweettooths. You want to be able to find your creatures and your artifacts. I think Patchwork Automaton is not as good as you might expect it. I think when you are facing a lot of interactive decks, something like mono blue, something like mono black, Especially in the early game, it can be good. However, our deck isn't really casting a whole lot of artifacts. It is instead just having artifacts enter in as effects off things like Rocco especially, or off of Yotia, or off of Sweettooth. So I think cutting out the patchwork automatons might be the way to go here, even though it sounds a little crazy. And instead, if you have the wild cards, if you have another Kayla's Reconstruction, maybe going up to 3 here, guaranteeing that you get 1 at least in the top third of your deck. Especially with the mono black and the aggro that we're seeing in a lot of the fairies decks, I think Glass Casket could be a nice addition. This even might work itself up to a 4 of, but I think Glass Casket's going to work well with something like Yotia. It's going to work well with something like Archivist. I think Archivist needs to be a 4 of, and I think Candy Trail probably needs to be a 4 of. Gleeful Demolition I wasn't super happy with. In some of the competing decks that you come up against, artifacts are present. You're going to get things like Skrelves, you're going to get things like the Toxic decks, you're going to get other kinds of decks that are trying to play with the food tokens and with artifact removal and that sort of thing. And Gleeful Demolition could be a weird little tech card if you end up seeing that in the ladder. But as it is, I don't think it's an innate inclusion in just a best of 1 deck. In terms of some other things, I think Food Coma is a little too late. It is best when you have rolled an Archivist into a Rocco into a Food Coma, but a lot of this 1, 2, 3, 4 rollout is just going to be disrupted. You're going to have 2 of 4 of those, or 3 of 4 of those, either murdered or bounced or something. So you need to find ways to introduce kind of stickier value. And I'm not sure Food Coma is it, especially when we have put in a few more Glass Caskets. So we're actually going to knock that out and go searching for some more food synergies. So some things that we might consider here. Something like a Sir Ginger the Meal Ender, which again is a rare, but it's also a potentially surprising upside play. So it comes in as a 3/1 for 2. It is a food token. You can sacrifice it, but you gain life equal to its power, which is kind of interesting. Whenever another artifact you control is put into a graveyard, you get to put a counter on it. So this is really going to gel well with things like treasure tokens. It's going to gel well with sacrificing food tokens. I think Sir Ginger the Meal Ender is going to be something that can come down a little earlier, maybe as a replacement to our Ward artifact. It can take the place of a Patchwork Automaton. But instead of relying on casting those artifacts, we can be kind of biding our time by sacrificing some food tokens, by sacrificing our candy trails, and we can buff up Sir Ginger a little bit. So I think Sir Ginger could be a sneaky play. It still activates things like Elvish Archivist. It seems like it has a little bit stickier value add. So I think Sir Ginger, definitely something to consider. Some other artifact creatures that we might think about here. Ginger Brute, to be honest, it might be kind of an annoyingly good inclusion here. It is also a food golem. You can sacrifice it to gain life. You can tap it for Yotia Declares War. It'll trigger Archivist. It'll trigger Sir Ginger. This feels pretty good. So maybe if you want to go a little bit more aggro, you can add 2 Ginger Brutes, subtract a couple of Candy Trails. But in terms of some of the other things that we have, especially if we look at the not collected, curious if there's anything here. Investigator's Journal might be a little interesting. I think it's a little slow for us. Could even think about working up to something big, like the portals. But when we stop and think about how this deck really did and what its weaknesses were, it really starts fading around turn 4, 5, and 6 if it hasn't drawn into what it needs to draw. And that's kind of the biggest issue, is the card draw itself. So let's think about maybe some ways to draw, maybe combining that with artifact in drawing. See what we get here. Norn's Wellspring could be interesting, because it gives us some more scry as well as some card draw. Platoon Dispenser kind of an interesting late stage card. Scroll Shift allows us to maybe save some of our creatures. However, you do have to keep 3 mana open, which is a little bit much. Combat Thresher as a double striker is kind of interesting, especially if you can get this on the board into something like a Rocco. And you can't find this with Kayla's Reconstruction, unfortunately, but it is a potential. Combat Courier, some of the Skull Bombs might be interesting. Surge Engine, if it wasn't blue, would be kind of nice. What is there in our colors? Reinforced Ronin is actually an interesting idea. Good in the early game, essentially a pay to draw card effect in the late game. I don't really hate that. Skull Bomb, not too bad. You can sacrifice it to draw. Sacrificing this will pump up your Sir Ginger. There might actually be a Sir Ginger Skull Bomb strategy to be had here. I also kind of like the idea of an Ogre Helm. Phyrexian Dragon Engine, also not terrible. Now, these aren't quite the engines, the drawing engines that you would hope for, but they do have a little bit more to offer, it seems. Tameo could be interesting, but again, it's in blue. Saheeli, again in blue, but maybe worth a look. What does Queen Kayla bin Krook do? Ooh, that's interesting. This might be an interesting build around for later on down the road. So I think, yeah, the more I look at this, I might want to include some spell bombs. It's either spell bombs, reinforced Ronins, or combat threshers, and this is probably just going to take a little bit more thinking. Scrapwork Mutt could be okay, but our 2 slot is just absolutely packed full. We'll go ahead and add a couple Furnace spell bombs here. I take it back. Add some Skull Bombs. I think this has a little bit more relevance for us. So we'll take one of those for now, and this is where we're going to leave it. So in the 1 slot, we'll have our Skull Bomb, our Teething Wurmlets, our Candy Trails. In this 2 slot, we're going to have Glass Caskets. Now, this could be a 4 of, depending on the meta, but we have even more removal in Yotia Declares War, which is going to trigger things like our Archivist twice. We have our Tough Cookie for our late game. Welcome to Sweettooth for a little bit of counter giving. We have a new and kind of obvious addition in Sir Ginger. It is a rare, and it is a little unproven, but just look at that art. You have to keep it in there. In the 3 slot, Restoration of Eiganjo, 1 Myria, Scholar of Antiquity, which also gets much better with the additions of the Skull Bombs and Sir Ginger and Glass Casket, since you can now tap these. 3 copies of Rocco, Street Chef, 2 copies of Kayla's Reconstruction, which will now hopefully have more targets now that we've taken out some of our enchantments. And then the mana base is really up to you. It's whatever you have in terms of the rare dual lands, just making sure that you have enough of the planes to get to this 3 mana cost, hopefully by turn 5, by turn 6. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me for this food deck. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as it does really help my small channel grow, and I'll see you in the next one.